Are there any other questions for our science panel? Yes, in the back.
I have a question about the deep sea surveys. You said that you count everything. Do you ever come into contact with new species? And if you do, what do you do then?
Yeah. Most the fish species here that we see have been seen before. We more frequently see a new invertebrate species, and in those cases what we do is it's one of those spin-off studies where we think we've seen a new species. We contact the world experts and let them know about it and invite them to spend time investigating that particular species.
Yeah. One of the things that is a kind of an ancillary byproduct of this for all of our groups, I think, is that because we're out there so much and we have people that are really experts at what they do, invasive species occasionally show up, and they're counting those as well. So if something new comes, I don't think it's an issue with deep sea, but it's certainly an issue with stuff with kelp forest and rock intertidal. We would collect it and we would bring it in to verify that it occurs and then notify the proper people that there is a new occurrence that we really don't know, as opposed to something that we do on our forest.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question for our science panel. Yes, you in the back.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Greg Kolar from Army Nuevo. Is the MPA model has been around? Is there any place in the world where it's been around for 30 or 40 years and people are inspired by the changes it's created? What you guys are hoping happens on our coast?
One of the finest examples of that is New Zealand, where they actually created protected areas more for fisheries purposes than for conservation purposes. And initially, in that process, of course, the fishermen went kicking and screaming all the way down. And now, in fact, the fishermen are endorsing the expansion of a network of protected areas around the coast of New Zealand. So that's one example where they've been around long enough to actually see a lot of fundamental changes attributed to the presence of the protected areas. The other that's a classic, of course, is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia that also has a long-standing system of protected areas. And that recently went through a major revision, but again, that's one that I think is largely embraced by Australians to maintain.
So, like the vision of MPAs is that you're really going to make a coastal comeback. That's what we're hoping for. Is like the fish come back, there are more of them, and that's kind of the thing you'd like us to, as interpreters, to start putting out to people. We're trying to bring the oceans back. It's a comeback. It's something you can get excited about.
Yeah, I think that's everyone's fondest wish, is to see MPAs have larger individuals and more diverse community. And we see that in the Point Lobos area, so we know it can work. But I think it's important, not only, something that's often overlooked, is that these MPAs are really important benchmarks for what the world would look like without human intervention. So they allow us to distinguish the difference between anthropogenic or human-induced change and climatic change. And that's a really important question. If are the changes that we will see in the next 50 or 100 years due to people or due to climate? And MPAs help with that.
I want to follow up too. There's really two benefits that are attributable to MPAs, or that we hope may be attributable. One of them is, do things get bigger, more stable? Are there more things inside an MPA? So bigger fish, more fish, perhaps a more stable system. And I think that there's a lot of evidence around the world to suggest that this is the case. And I feel pretty safe saying that this is likely to be the case in California. The other effect, which I think you were alluding to, is that it could be the basis for a restoration of the coast, or of coastal ecosystems, even outside, which is one of the benefits that we really hope, but there's not a huge amount of evidence for. Not that it doesn't occur, just hasn't been really assessed. So the idea has been that if you make enough of these and they're big enough, that there will be these things that Ricky was talking about, which are their spillover effects, both in terms of adults and in terms of larvae, the recruitment effect, and that will act to make the areas outside of them more resilient and perhaps even grow. And that's one of the goals of the MLPA, and that's one of the goals of the assessment. It's also one of the most difficult things to try to assess. So that's the second benefit. It's going to be a lot more difficult to actually assess that.
A couple of years ago, I saw an interesting presentation on rafting of species on free-floating kelp beds, up and down the coast or whatever. Are there ongoing projects that are looking at not only the movement of species out into the water column from these protected areas, but also from distant protected areas and as far as recolonization or what goes?
To date, it's been modeling. I mean, there are, which would be mostly oceanographic models, but there are some new approaches that use genetics and also some other tags they could do as well. And I think for adults, and Ricky and both Mark can talk about this, there's also actual tags that could be found from one location. They can go from one location to another, back or in the middle.
Another thing I knew that I haven't talked about is that we switchblade plant sonic transmitters from fish and track their movements. Try to determine whether a fish is going to spill out of an MPA. What's the home range of fish? Mark's got some students and colleagues working on that as well. There are people who understand that the movement of fishes is an important component of understanding MPAs, and so to the best extent we can, we're trying to cover key species and learn about the movements.
And just one more follow-up, and that is, when these things were designed, and both Ricky and Caitlin talked about this, and Rick and Mark were part of this, there were these twin sets of goals with respect to the size of these things and the spacing, and it was just discussed, but one of the goals was that they would be connected. There would be a network that would allow connectivity, and we have yet to see whether that is actually in practice, because we haven't been able to follow, but studies like Rex and Mark's and others will allow us to do that.
Okay, with that, I'm going to thank our science panelists, Mark Carr, Pete Raimondi, and Rick Starr. Thank you all very much.